His lungs burned in his chest as he forced himself up the endless staircase. Outside, a night sky lit with fire roared away, and the heat from it threatened to burn him to a crisp. An explosion sounded from far above, followed by a shrill scream and a dull thud. No, no, no. His feet slammed against marble as he ignored his body's desperate pain. Blue eyes remained locked on each doorway before him as he barreled through, until eventually, with an angry scream, he burst onto the rooftop proper. Pyrrha looked towards him with an expression of purest shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a torrent of blood. She fell forwards, transfixed. Jaune's legs collapsed as he caught her, the girl's slight weight driving him down as he cushioned her fall and cradled her head into his arms. Angry tears burned in the corners of his eyes. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry. I won't let it happen again." His partner smiled a beautiful smile as she reached up to touch his cheek with one hand. She tried to speak, but the blood prevented it. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony as he forced himself up the endless staircase. Outside, a night sky lit with fire roared away, and the heat from it threatened to burn him to a crisp. An explosion sounded from far above, followed by a shrill scream. Not this time. Not after he promised. Jaune screamed in anger as he tripped and fell. He crawled the last few steps and threw himself towards the door and out onto the rooftop. Pyrrha's knees hit the ground as she looked down at the arrow that jolted from her breastbone. One hand came up to grip the shaft, as though she might pull it free. The heat from her body was familiar as he cradled her. His hands, desperately, futilely, tried to staunch the blood that pooled atop her. He knew it wouldn't be enough. "I won't let it happen again," he sobbed atop her. His forehead pressed against hers as tears coursed from his eyes. His partner smiled a beautiful smile as she reached up to touch his cheek with one hand, but the words she tried to speak were lost. His body was dull and his mind duller as he took the steps 2 or 3 at a time. The pain had long since ceased to mean anything. The ache in his muscles nothing more than the whimpering cries of a body that longed to die. He did not let it. Outside, the fire roared and the heat from it threatened to burn him to a crisp. Like it always did. Like it always would. An explosion sounded above him. The Tower of Beacon was a familiar sight, even with its great cogwheels and broken masonry. Pyrrha turned to regard him with an almost calm expression. The blood that bubbled from her lips didn't seem to surprise her, nor did she reach for the arrow that killed her. Jaune's mind was numb as he caught and lowered her to the floor once more. The tears no longer came, though something like fire burned away at his heart. His breath escaped him in a gasp as he stared into her emerald eyes. "I won't let it happen again." His partner smiled a beautiful smile and reached up to touch his cheek with one hand. This time there was no blood, and the words she spoke were clear. "You will, Jaune. You always do." The morning trill of birdsong mixed with bright sunlight that streamed through thin curtains, bathing the room in a ruddy glow. The window, left open from the night before, allowed the soft scent of jasmine to waft inside, and in the distance the first signs of waking life could be heard as early risers made their way to breakfast. It was, in a word, a really shitty morning. Jaune yawned for what felt like the 10th time as he staggered over to the dorm's room's only desk and fell onto the seat. His hands fumbled with his shoes that fought against him, while his eyes tried to close time and time again. The plan to stop Blake's interference in the White Fang was progressing. That was all he could say, since it didn't seem to be going well or bad. It was just progressing. Things were happening, and so long as those things didn't involve his team drawing the ire of Roman and Cinder, that was all well good. He just wished things could progress a little faster, preferably so that he could go back to having a realistic night's sleep. "Are you sure you're not sick?" Weiss asked as she watched him. It was bad enough yesterday, but you look even worse now. He sighed and tried to sway her hand aside, only to miss and hit her hip instead. I'm fine, he said. He didn't think she brought it from the way she frowned at him, but that didn't make it any less true. He wasn't sick, he was just tired, and the nightmares hadn't helped. It felt like his fight against the White Fang had brought his mind back to what was going to happen, whether he liked it or not. What were you and Blake doing last night anyway? You both came back late. Father-daughter bonding. We did no such thing. Sex then? Jaune tried. Weiss didn't even raise an eyebrow, though Blake did let an indulgent squeak. Well, how else would you explain it? Father-daughter bonding works well. Blake surrendered. Adorable. Weiss rolled her eyes. Either way, perhaps you might want to avoid any late-night jaunts in the future if this is the result. I can't believe I'm saying this about you, but maybe you need more sleep. I'm fine. Seriously. You're acting like this isn't completely normal for me. You've always been tired and lazy. Yang laughed. But Weiss is right. You've never looked so spent before. A yawn threatened to break free, but he smothered it as best he could. It wasn't so much the sleep itself, but the consecutive nights of action with no time to rest. His legs still ached from the spa with sun, while his eyes stung from the early morning light. This is nothing. I'm just tired, and I didn't get much sleep. I'm not sick and I don't need medical attention, nor you guys fussing over me. It was unbelievably aggravating how the three girls exchanged looks above his head, some obvious unspoken message passing between them. Why not call off sick? Blake suggested. I'd have thought missing a day of school would be up your alley. And trust you not to rush off and investigate the White Fang alone? Not a chance. He shrugged. Because I'd have to go see the doctor and she'd be able to tell I'm not sick. I'm tired. Not cruising for detention. Also, the doctor's a psychopath. Didn't you sleep with her? Psychopath in bed. Jaune said and held one hand up. He then turned to the other. Psychopath with a hypodermic needle. One is less good than the other. You should know given your taste in books. We don't need to hear about your disgusting conquest. Weiss growled. Nor Blake's questionable reading taste. In fact, I recall saying any talk of such was banned. Blake started it. What? Well, I'm finishing it, the heiress said. Your performance in yesterday's spa was nothing less than horrifying. You didn't even have some dirty trick prepared to beat Wukong, and that's just not you. Huh. Jaune blinked, uncertain whether that was a compliment or an insult. I don't think you should come to class today. I think you should visit the infirmary. Normally, the thought of such wouldn't have been too bad, even with Kitsune's experimental medical treatment. Blake and the White Fang was still a thing, however, and he wasn't going to relax on this until the dance started. He had to find out if Blake had another location in mind and make sure Crow got to it first. Whether Weiss liked it or not, he was going to be in lessons with everyone else. Looks like Mum's made up her mind. Yang completely failed to whisper. Does Dad need his bestest and most beautiful daughter to take him to the infirmary? To add insult to injury, she clasped her hands before her chest and smiled down at him. You're enjoying this entirely too much. Oh? She cocked one hand to one ear. Is something wrong? Is a certain someone getting annoyed because everyone is trying to make sure he's okay? Blake and Weiss shared an amused look, while Yang continued to blink prettily down at him. Jaune sighed and glared up at her. You know, daughter, he said, you're not so old that I can't bend you over my knee. Oh really? Yang laughed. Do I need to be punished? Is Daddy going to spank me with his own ah? Yang's words were cut off as she stumbled forward when he grabbed her blazer. She fell across his legs as he reached down and slapped a hand firmly against her backside. He then lifted it and spanked the other side for good measure, before letting her stand up. She stood ramrod straight, one hand rubbing her behind as she stared at him. Blake's book slapped onto the floor with a dull thud. The girl shocked, yellow eyes locked onto him. Weiss seemed to be trying to close her mouth too, with limited success. As far as distractions went, it was a fairly successful one. "Bad, Yang," he warned and pointed a finger at her. "Now say sorry." Lilac eyes flashed red in an instant as a bare leg caused the chair he'd been sat on to explode into splinters. Her hair seemed to glow and her white teeth were grit in a furious snarl. Not that he expected any different. Jaune grinned and whistled at the heat he felt from the aura as he slipped under her arm and towards the door. "Well, now that the discipline has been dispensed, I'll see you all in class." He waved. "Wait, you're going to the infirmary?" Weiss tried to stop him only to accidentally trip Yang as the blonde sought to pulverize his skull. The two girls went down and entangled of limbs as Blake stared on in horror. Jaune waved one hand and slipped out the door. Sometimes it was just too easy. "Hey Jaune," Ruby greeted as he stepped into Oblek's history class 30 minutes later. "You weren't at breakfast?" "I ate earlier." He lied, all the better to avoid her worried frowns. He didn't have much of an appetite and he had eaten the evening before. "My team aren't looking for me, are they? If by team you mean my sister and by looking you mean trying to kill you, then yes, they are looking for you." Ruby gave him a dirty look, an odd emotion for her since it made her look like a cute puppy whose toy had been taken away. "What exactly did you do to Yang?" Nothing she didn't deserve or ask for, though for good measure, he made sure to sit firmly between Ruby and Nora. Ren would have capitulated at the first sign of female wrath, while he wasn't convinced Pyrrha wouldn't betray him if she thought the reason was good enough. It wasn't a moment too soon either, as Yang burst into the room, eyes still red and hair of vibrant gold as she looked around for him. It wasn't a difficult task on account of how Nora waved one hand in the air, then the other pointed at his head. "Thank you, Nora." He sighed. "You." Yang seethed as she stalked up to him and planted her hands atop his desk. "You." She repeated. "Me?" He nodded. "Jaune!" Weiss shouted as she pushed her way into the room. "Indeed?" "Jaune." Ruby sighed, head in hands. "Students!" Dr. Oblek interrupted as he let himself in. "If you would— Nora!" The classroom went silent as they all looked towards the girl with one foot atop her desk. Beside her, Ren held his head in his hands. "Quite, The teacher sighed and sat down. It didn't take him long to notice that everyone had, however. Perhaps the fact that the table Jaune was sat at had started to smolder was an indication. "Miss Xiaolong, if you could take a seat." Jaune raised an amused eyebrow as he watched his teammate actually consider it. She seemed to struggle with the thought that detention for knocking him out might be worth it. But in the end, she sighed and sat down on the other side of Ruby, though not before she glared at him. "Sir?" Weiss said. "I think our leader is ill and needs to visit the infirmary." Mr. Ark?" The teacher looked up towards him. "I'm fine," he called back. He didn't fail to note how Weiss's eyes narrowed dangerously. No doubt he'd be hearing later from her for that. "I'm just a little under the weather. I'll be fine." "There you have it, Miss Snee. Why don't you take a seat?" His entire team glared at him as they took their own seats. Jaune sighed and tried to ignore the guilt that wormed its way through his stomach. They were worried and concerned for him, and it was heartwarming. It really was. They were exactly what every teammate should be. What every team should be. "I'll make it up to you guys," he promised. He would make it up to them when he saved them all. Weiss and Yang continued to hound their leader later that afternoon, Yang's punishment for his impromptu spanking had been to glare balefully at him for over 2 hours, then forget all about it. She did step on his foot once or twice as they walked, but otherwise, her temper burned as hot and short as it ever did. Blake could admit to her own amusement as she struggled to hide her own little chuckles. She sympathized with her partner. She really did. If Jaune had done that to her, well, she'd been itching to introduce the hilt of Grumble Shroud to the back of his head too. Despite that, and although she'd never admit it, the sight had been a little funny. Yang must never know. The humor in this situation wasn't enough to distract Blake from the gnawing sensation that ate away at her. Guilt was not a new sensation for her. She'd experienced it often enough, particularly when the White Fang began to move away from vigilanteism and towards terrorism. She felt it too when she abandoned Adam, even if he had abandoned the ideas he once preached. Her leader and teammate Jean-Arc was both like and nothing like Adam Torres. He sat slouched between Yang and Weiss at that moment. His eyes were open, yet it seemed like a chore. He yawned loudly, only to pause and smother it before anyone else could notice. Blake's eyes drifted shut as she let out a short sigh. She had noticed, and she dared imagine her teammates had as well. As much as he tried to hide it, as much as he tried to avoid causing them any trouble, their friend was not at his best. It shouldn't have been a big thing. People got ill all the time, and a short rest and some antibiotics were likely enough to see him back to normal. All he had to do was avoid any strenuous activity, stay warm, and get a good night's sleep. Which was exactly what she didn't want. Hence the guilt. The White Fang were being pushed back by the hunters and police, but that would only make them desperate. She needed to find out what was going on before a huge mistake was made. Doing so required Jaune to come with her, if only to prevent another disaster like the docks. She had another location in mind and had intended to visit it that very night. Golden eyes narrowed as she sighed and tried to fight down the frustration she felt. Her hands slowly clenched into fists. Was this her fault? It was a question that had plagued her since that morning. It struck the moment she saw how tired he was, and it only got worse when Weiss mentioned their little trip the previous evening. They hadn't gone far, and they had been back before midnight, but the exhaustion he showed was obvious. He'd been limping too on that night. She'd notice, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. She noticed it when he ducked under Yang's punch too. It was just the slightest larch, something that could have been written away as a stumble had she not been looking for it. There was something wrong with Jaune, and the promise he had made to her only made it worse. Had she exploited him with that? The thought of it made her bite her lip and look down to her desk. She knew from the docks that he would risk his life to protect her, so had she taken advantage of that when she asked him to help? At the time, she would have said no, but right now she wasn't so sure. He had promised to help her, and he had, at the cost of his health. A little illness wasn't so bad, but when it interfered enough that he got injured by sun, when it might interfere in such a way as to endanger his life when they investigated the White Fang, then it became a problem. Could she honestly, knowing all of that, ask him to accompany her again tonight? No. Could she, knowing what the White Fang were like, afford to ignore them? No. But she promised Jaune not to go at it alone too, and also to let him know in advance. And she felt an unusual desire to keep her word. She groaned and buried her face in her hands. Normally I would not think twice about breaking a promise. Why am I refusing to break this one? There was no choice. The White Fang would have to wait. She only prayed they wouldn't take advantage of that. But at the end of the day, Blake decided as she looked to her friends. Her team came first. I'll let it go. Yang growled, but only because you're sick and injured. Try it again, and I'll realign your spinal column. Now I'm injured? Jaune rolled his eyes. Wow. My day apparently keeps getting worse. We've all noticed how sore your leg is. Weiss snapped. Stop trying to pretend otherwise. Your machoism isn't necessary here, and I'd rather not be stuck having to wheel you around. Didn't you promise me you would have it looked at? Blake joined in, and silently apologized when he gave her a betrayed expression. I didn't quite say that. You said it would be gone by morning. You said that if it wasn't, you would visit Miss Kitsune yourself. Sometimes, it helped to have such a good memory. Uh-oh. Yang grinned. Busted. Jaune sighed and leaned back. He looked towards his teammate with narrowed eyes. I will go visit her, he said. But not now. I never said when. Blake scoffed and shook her head, even as Ruby started to berate her friend for playing games with his words. In a way, she supposed he was right. He never explicitly said when he would go. It wasn't breaking a promise, just twisting it into something unrecognizable. And when will you go? She asked. Later, he said evasively. I need to know when I have a free evening. She caught on immediately, and the shame she felt earlier surged back. He meant when she wouldn't try and drag him out to risk his life. Was that why he refused to keep his promise to her? Because it would conflict with the first he had made. Her eyes narrowed as she firmed her resolve. Then you can go tonight, she said. I have a quiet evening planned myself. You sure? He gave her a suspicious look. I promised, didn't I? You did. He met and held her gaze for the longest time, no doubt running through the promise she made in his mind. She had sworn to let him know in advance and not to rush off alone like the last time. She wasn't going to break that now. This is one of those conversations with subtext, isn't it? Blake blinked and looked around, suddenly aware of the number of eyes watching them with curiosity. Yang wore a whole shit-eating grin, the kind which suggested she made up her own mind on what they were talking about and came to the completely wrong conclusion. Care to share with the class? Yang teased. Or is this another one of your precious father-daughter bonding secrets? Oh gods. What was she supposed to say? Blake's eyes widened as she noticed how everyone, even Nora and Pyrrha, were watching her with amused looks. She couldn't absolutely destroy the mood by saying they had been running around after the White Fang, nor could she admit to hiding that from the rest of her team. To her horror, there was only one option. It's a father and daughter thing. She cringed. Jaune the asshole actually giggled. Oh, I bet it is. Yang smirked and turned to Pyrrha. Jaune and Blake were out bonding all night. To Blake's horror, the redhead looked towards her and blushed. Whatever you're thinking, you're wrong, she hissed. We weren't doing anything. Mummy, Yang called in an exaggerated tone. Blake was out making kissy face with Daddy. Blake's hand slammed down on the table as she stood up. I was not. Guys? Ruby tried to interrupt. Jaune and Blake, he's sitting in a tree. K-I-S-O. Blake's bow twitched, but she managed to smile. Should I tell everyone how you squealed when he bent you over his knee? Yang's chair clattered back as she stood up. Try it. Guys? Blake ignored Ruby and glared at her partner. If she even dared to keep going, Blake wouldn't be responsible for what terrible secrets passed her lips. Don't test me. She tried to telepathically send. I'll do it. Will you both sit down before you make a scene? Weiss cut into their impending argument with a snarl. Seriously. I expect this kind of behavior from Yang and Jaune. Not you, Blake. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what Weiss meant. Her ass hit the chair with a thump as she shot back down. More than a few people had started to watch, no doubt catching on that there would be some good drama and entertainment about to happen. Damn it, damn it, damn it, damn it. How on remnant had Yang managed to goad her into something like that? Sorry, she whispered in humiliation. Do you have anything to add? Weiss asked Jaune. You are the team leader after all. Listen to your mother, he rebuked. Not what I meant. Blake couldn't help but lower her head as the heiress began to tear into Jaune for that comment. Ruby giggled from nearby. It's kind of weird how like a family you all are. A really dysfunctional one, but still a family. It's like a sitcom. Nora giggled. Blake groaned as she hid her face behind her book. Any further embarrassment was cut off as another team came over to provide a convenient distraction. Blake didn't recognize them at first, though something about their hairstyles said she ought to. Fortunately, they didn't challenge her memory but instead walked up to Ruby. Hey Ruby. The green-haired girl among them grinned. The cafeteria is pretty full. Mind if we sit here? Oh, sure. Ruby laughed and waved for the three to sit. Guys, this is the team from Haven I met the other day. This was Emerald, that's Mercury, and their leader is Cinder. Charmed. The black-haired woman smiled to each of them. Blake didn't respond and quickly looked back to her food. Now, people had never been her cup of tea, and while she definitely did recognize them from somewhere, she couldn't quite recall it as a bad thing. Nothing White Fang related, at least. I remember you, Yang crowd. You were the guys that met me at that bookshop. Ah, that was it. Blake remembered now that her partner had pointed it out. Yeah, Yang, wasn't it? The tan girl chuckled. I wondered if you'd remember. It was Weiss, Blake, and... Jaune, was it? Blake hid her smile and waited for their leader to respond. After he spent so long purposely getting her name wrong, she wanted to see how he'd react to the show being on the other foot. He didn't say anything. His eyes were firmly locked on the small plate of chicken as he fork pushed some meat around it. He didn't eat. He rarely did. But he seemed to be giving the food his utmost attention. And was it her imagination? Or were his shoulders a little stiffer? It's Jaune. Why stepped in before the silence could become any more awkward. And please, forgive him. He's been feeling under the weather for the past few days. Got it. Emerald said. He did look a little out of it at that spa. Gotta say, I didn't expect it with him grabbing the guy's tail. Oh, that's nothing. Yang leaned forward and quickly drew the girl into an epic retelling of some of his more dramatic spas. Blake tuned it out with the patience of someone used to dealing with Nora. Instead, she found herself curiously interested in the way the leader of this team kept her eyes locked on to her teammate. She was a beautiful woman, even Blake could admit. Why was she so focused on her teammate though? Weiss seemed to notice and coughed once to draw the woman's attention away. Jaune doesn't mean any offense, she said. We've been trying to convince him to go see the doctor all day. He's not normally so quiet. Please don't take it personally. Oh, not at all. The woman smiled. I think I can see it myself. He looks quite fatigued. She leaned forward to touch a hand to the blonde's arm, and Blake didn't fail to note how Weiss bristled at such an action. Perhaps you would like us to escort you there? I'm fine. Jaune's clipped reply was perhaps the biggest sign of his health. Normally, if so beautiful a woman was touching him so, he'd have shown a far different response. I can handle it just fine, thank you. Weiss stepped in with a smile far too polite to be honest. She tugged Jaune aside and away from the woman's hand, which fell to the table. Jaune didn't seem to resist in the slightest. If anything, he allowed it. I don't believe we've met before. Do you know Jaune from somewhere? Not personally. Cinder smiled. But I've heard all about him from a close friend of mine. Heard about? Oh dear. Blake felt the urge to slam her head onto the table, practically at the coy look this woman was sending his way. She probably meant someone he'd slept with. She hadn't realized he had managed to bang someone from Haven already. Seriously, that had to be a record. The transfer students had been here less than a week. Weiss flushed too, and she glared balefully at Jaune before turning back to the woman, all smiles. I'm sure whatever you've heard, it has been far exaggerated, she said. Perhaps, Cinder smiled. Either way, I wouldn't mind seeing for myself. Well, that was certainly forward. He's ill. Of course. I meant when he was better. She leaned forward once more, this time past Weiss to place a hand on the blonde's cheek. He stiffened under her touch but didn't move away. Blue eyes met amber as the woman smiled. You should visit the doctor if you feel unwell, she whispered. My personal belief is that a problem left unattended can grow into something far more dangerous. Better to deal with it immediately, rather than let it get worse. Jaune's chair clattered against the floor as he stood up. His eyes were wide and his chest heaved. And for a moment, Blake wondered if he was going to be sick. I'm going to go to see Miss Kitsune, he gasped. I promised I would, and now's as good a time as any. Shall I? Weiss hadn't even managed to stand before he held a hand out to stop her. It's fine. I'm fine. I just need some fresh air. Blake watched him go with a little worry, though she soon realized she wasn't the only one to do so. Oh my, Cinder forcooed. I do hope it wasn't anything I said.